First focal plane versus second focal plane. This has a lot of information to it. I'm going to do my best to make it somewhat concise for all of you, but it's a big question we get asked a lot. A lot of you have asked it out there in comments all over the place, so here we go. Let's start out with second focal plane. Second focal plane is the one many of you are probably used to. If you grew up hunting or if you started out hunting and you used kind of a simple 3 to 9 power rifle scope, chances are it was probably second focal plane. As you change the magnification on that scope, looking through the optic, you'd probably notice that changing the magnification makes the image grow and shrink. That's exactly what it does. From 3 power to 9 power, for example, that image will appear to get about 3 times bigger than it was on its lowest setting, on its highest setting. You would also probably notice that the reticle does not appear to change at all with that change in magnification. It just stays the same size as the image around it grows and shrinks. That is second focal plane. You see, what's happening there is that even though the reticle doesn't appear to be changing at all, it's actually changing the entire time, all the way up until usually you get to the highest magnification, which is where its size in relation to the image size has been scaled up correctly. Because our reticles are a lot like rulers. They usually have hash marks that are correlated to MOA or MRAD or ballistic drop compensation of some sort for some caliber. And all those hash marks and features of our reticle need to be in proper scale to the image in order for them to really mean anything, or at least mean what they meant on the reticle manual that you got with your optic. So if you're using a 3 to 9, let's go back to that example, and a BDC, and you wanted to use those holdovers with the BDC out at 400 yards, let's say, you would have to make sure that you're on, again, we're going to assume it's one of those scopes that has it calibrated to the highest power, 9 power in this case. You're going to want to make sure you're on 9 power in order to use that BDC reticle. If you're on one of the other powers where the image got smaller but the reticle didn't get smaller with it, and you try to use those holdovers, everything's not to the right scale. So you're probably, unfortunately, going to miss if that's the case. 9 power though, it'll work just fine. Now, one really important thing to point out with first focal plane and second focal plane is a lot of people hear us talking about the fact that second focal plane, the reticle only works when it's on the highest magnification. Now, that's talking about all the features about your reticle around the center crosshair. The center crosshair in and of itself though, that one single point doesn't have to worry about scale. Whether reticle size, image size, it really doesn't matter. It's a single point in space. It always works, no matter what magnification you're on, and no matter whether you have a first focal plane or a second focal plane reticle. What does that mean? It means that you can always dial your turrets and use the center crosshair no matter what magnification you're on. Now let's talk about first focal plane. First focal plane is the one that a lot of people think is pretty sweet because a lot of the big time PRS competitors or professional end users are using first focal plane for their long range shooting. A lot of people out there will tell you if you're planning to do long range shooting, anything but first focal plane just won't work. Now that's really not true. First focal plane has its own inherent advantages to specific types and applications of long range shooting, but long range shooting in general doesn't have to be accomplished only with first focal plane. Again, like we just said, with a second focal plane reticle, like the one we have in the Viper HST here, for example, a great 6 to 24 by 50 scope with tall exposed dialing turrets that can dial you out to long range and you can just shoot off that center reticle. This scope works excellent at long range. And since it's second focal plane, it's actually a little bit cheaper than the first focal plane options too. They have a little bit more complicated manufacturing process. So if you're somebody who just wants to shoot long range and not have a giant budget, something like this would work just fine. Now, where does first focal plane come into play? So remember when we talked about that image size growing and shrinking with your magnification as you changed it, and the reticle on a second focal plane optic does not appear to grow and shrink with the image. Well, in a first focal plane rifle scope, the reticle will appear to grow and shrink with the image, which is kind of weird because, like we were talking about with scales of things, that actually means it's retaining perfect scale to the image as the image is getting bigger and smaller too. They both grow and shrink at the exact same rate. So if you're using a scope like this Viper PST Gen 2 5 to 25 by 50, you'll notice that when you zoom all the way into 25 power, the reticle looks kind of big. It actually takes up a fair amount of your field of view. relative to how it looked when it was on 5 power, when you zoomed way out and the image got smaller and all of a sudden the reticle was just a tiny thing in the center of your field of view. In fact, in most cases, you may even need to turn the illumination on to really see it really well, which is a reason why some hunters may not want to go for first focal plane, despite how awesome it sounds on the internet. When those first focal plane reticles get zoomed out with the image, they do get pretty small. And if you're hunting in thick brush or timber or a lot of shade or something like that, that reticle may be tough to see unless you crank up the illumination. But anyway, where this really comes into play, and again, like we said, with a lot of, let's say, PRS competitors, for example, if you're shooting at long range and you have a number of different targets that you're going to have to engage in, say, a relatively short amount of time, a short enough amount of time that you wouldn't have time to go up and dial each shot individually or change your magnification around a lot, this is where first focal plane can be an advantage. What a lot of them might do is with a Viper PST, again 5-25 by 50 like this, they may set the magnification at a magnification somewhere in the middle. Let's say 15 power, for example. For them, that's just good enough to hit that target at 300 yards, and it's also just good enough to hit the target at 900 yards. They can see it just fine. Well, now being on 15 power, if this were a second focal plane optic, they wouldn't be able to use their reticle and all of its MOA or MRAD hash marks or windage dots or anything like that. They would just have to shoot off the center reticle. And then they would have to be dialing all the time throughout this entire course of fire for a 300, a 500, and a 900 yard target, for example. Well, if they have a first focal plane reticle, they don't have to worry about that so much. They can actually just use the holdovers that they've figured out in their ballistics calculator in either MOA or MRAD on their reticle, and they can just engage the targets rather quickly and use their holdovers as they were intended on that middle power. Another nice advantage of having first focal plane is just the fact that magnification isn't something you always need to consciously think about every time you're about to take a shot. Again, if you're using a lot of the features on your reticle. Let's say you were on 23 power in this Viper PST here, and it looked kind of like 25 power. It's sort of hard to tell the difference, and you wanted to use a holdover real fast. If it were second focal plane, that would be probably enough to throw you off, enough to miss at longer distances. With first focal plane, it doesn't matter, because that reticle is always in the proper scale to the image. So to really kind of boil this down, and there's a ton more we could certainly speak to, which we're always happy to speak to in the comments or on the phone, email, social media, you know, all that stuff. But to really boil it down, the kind of people that want second focal plane are probably going to be hunters who don't want their reticle to get so tiny on the lower powers, which are the powers they can take advantage of a wider field of view and better low light performance. They don't want that reticle to get so tiny on those powers that they can't use it. And plus, really, when it's so tiny anyways, you can't really see the holdovers that well, so it's not really something you always need when you're hunting. So hunters and recreational shooters, long-range folks who are A-OK having the time to dial each one of their shots and shoot off the center reticle. Again, you can always dial and shoot off the center reticle, no matter what scope you have. Now, if you're thinking about doing something that involves a little bit more long-range shooting in a timed format, like competition, or some professional users certainly may have situations like this as well, first focal plane may be worth the cost premium it has over its comparative second focal plane options. This PST, again, for example, is available in a second focal plane option too, with a slightly different reticle, and the second focal plane option is a little bit less expensive. But if you really feel as though you're going to need those holdovers in the crunch time, where you don't have time to figure out what magnification you're on, or dial each shot, first focal plane certainly may be worth it. And that really is what a lot of the professional and competition end users are doing. Now, there always will be folks out there who say they want to do both, competition shooting and hunting, and they want to use the same rifle and scope. That's fine, and you can really do probably either one of these for both. Just understand that one way that you go is going to have its pros and cons, which we went into. If you go all in on the first focal plane, just be prepared that if you zoom out when you're hunting, the reticle may get small enough that it's kind of hard to make out. If you go second focal plane and you go to your competition, you may have to take a little bit more time to consciously think about magnification, dial your turrets, all that stuff. just know that it's very, very hard to get the all-around perfect optic for every single scenario. Optics are always a game of trade-offs. Now, this has been a really high-level explanation. There certainly may be scenarios that I haven't described yet where first focal plane would work perfectly or second focal plane would work perfectly. Maybe the other way around, they wouldn't work. That's all stuff that you're going to have to determine when you're going through your list of must-haves and can live withouts. But again, this has just been a real general overview. Hopefully it helped some of you out there who didn't really even know where to start in terms of what first focal plane and second focal plane really even were. We're always happy to discuss this topic more, again, in the comments below, social media, email, phone, all those things. So always feel free to talk to us about that stuff. We're all hunters and shooters ourselves that love this stuff. So if you have any other questions, by all means, do that. If you have any other video ideas that you want to see us do, let us know as well. Otherwise, we will see you next time. Thanks everybody for watching.